We would say that Miami isn't what we expected, but we actually didn't really know what to expect from this city. We knew we wanted a break from this, and that we wanted a city we could explore a bit, instead of just going to a beach resort in the Caribbean, which obviously has some benefits too. On the positive side, Miami has a very unique aesthetic and vibe. Spanish architecture, Art Deco, palm trees, cool skyscrapers, elevated rail, tropical colors, it's all really nice. We were even pleasantly surprised by the transit, especially for a place not known for it. On the negative side, this might be the most pedestrian-unfriendly major city we've ever walked around, definitely in recent memory. It's the design of the roads, which feel like highways, and sometimes literally are highways. It's the oversized cars with strongly tinted windows, and drivers acting like pedestrians don't matter. Florida is the third worst state in the US for pedestrian fatalities, and it shows.
We wake up in Montreal to find a city literally covered in ice. A few hours later, we touch down in South Florida. After a long walk in an airport people mover, we end up on an express bus to Miami Beach, where we're staying at the northern tip of South Beach. The bus only comes every 30 minutes, but we have good luck and get it just before it leaves, and the ride is fast. We walk along a really nice boardwalk on the beach, with the higher density hotels and residences, and we go a bit inland, with large suburban-style homes. The weather on our trip is pretty great, up to 28 Celsius or 82 Fahrenheit, which is a warm July or August day back home, basically the perfect winter escape. Walking around, it didn't take long for us to notice something. Miami has a crazy number of large SUVs. Where we've lived in Canada, you can find lots of smaller crossover SUVs, like the Subaru Forester or Honda CR-V, but full-sized SUVs like the Chevy Suburban or GMC Yukon are not common. The most we've ever seen them was government processions when we lived in Ottawa. In Florida, they seem to be everywhere, and it really makes the streets feel less safe, especially when they have tinted windows so strong that you can barely see that there's anyone inside, let alone make eye contact with drivers at a crosswalk, like the state of Florida tells you you're supposed to. See large SUVs like this very often back home. The newer, bulkier style of pickup truck is pretty common these days. These beefy vehicles with high hoods are measurably more dangerous. A recent study found that each 10 centimeter or 4-inch increase in front end height is associated with a 22% increase in the likelihood of fatality if it hits a pedestrian.
The next day, we go into Miami proper. We just missed the bus, but it doesn't matter because it runs every 7.5 minutes. It's a dense tourist route, so not representative, but it's still impressive for a city not exactly known for its transit. Another nice surprise is open payment, where you can tap your credit card or phone instead of worrying about change or tickets. Our city still doesn't have this yet. It's inconvenient for residents, and it's basically begging tourists to never take the bus. We get dropped off downtown and we start walking north, and it's not a great pedestrian experience to say the least. From inattentive drivers, to blocked sidewalks, to crossings that don't exist, to narrow sidewalks, to more blocked sidewalks. Seriously, there is no reason for this fire truck to be parked like this. There's plenty of room behind. We eventually make it to Wynwood, which exemplifies one of our favorite parts of Miami, how colorful the city can be. In this neighborhood, it's bright murals, but you can also see it in the pastels of the Art Deco in Miami Beach. The tropical look might not work everywhere, but we wish more cities would lean more into being colorful and lively like this.
After Wynwood, we walk back towards downtown, going around more blocked sidewalks and intersections that take a cross-me-at-your-own-risk approach. On the bright side, we come across Brightline, a higher speed train that connects Miami to Orlando. Florida has a reputation as a weird and eclectic place, and the fact that a private company is running faster trains in this car-centric environment than anything we have in Canada definitely fits into that. To get downtown, we get on a different kind of train, Metro Mover, Miami's automated people mover that we found surprisingly useful. We get off a few stations down the line to see downtown. We thought these barriers were here to extend the sidewalk, but they're probably protection for the federal building. Nice bike lane though, and here's a pedestrian street. We cross a big road with a parking lot in the middle to get to an outdoor mall by the water, before walking back downtown to find a really weird surprise. Wild chickens just running around. Next, we take another ride on the Metro Mover across the water to the neighborhood of Brickell. Miami's trains are elevated, partly because it's hard to dig tunnels in Florida, but we like the view and the aesthetic, although the short trains look kind of funny. We walked around Brickell for a bit and saw this robot delivery before going to Brickell Station to catch a bus to Little Havana, which showed up fast. At the station, we see a multi-use pathway called the Underline that we would have liked to spend more time exploring if we had more than a few days in the city.
We get dropped off near Little Havana to a pedestrian nightmare. First, drivers kept trying to pass a stopped school bus that was dropping off kids, which is illegal. So the bus laid on its horn and actually parked diagonally on the street to physically block the cars and let the kids cross. Which, respect to the bus driver, but it's kind of crazy that anyone has to do that to stop traffic and protect kids. Then we saw that our intersection was deactivated or something, with the lights turned off and everything else covered up. It was an awful place to cross the street. Older shots on Google Street View don't show any intersection lights at all, so let's hope it's in the process of being installed instead of taken away or out of service. Next, we wandered around Little Havana, the historic center of the Cuban exile community. We thought that Spanish was a major minority language in Miami, but it turns out that it's actually the majority language in Miami proper, and roughly on par with English across the whole metro area, which is super interesting. You hear Spanish everywhere and you're often greeted with it in stores. We even encountered someone who didn't speak English but did speak French as a second language, from having lived in France. Fortunately, we live in a French-speaking city and we're able to communicate with them fine.
Little Havana is lively and fun, although a little more traffic-choked than we would like. We start walking north to get some groceries before taking the bus back. We see this truck parked mostly on the sidewalk. It's easy to walk around if you're on foot, but maybe not so much if you have a stroller or a wheelchair. Like the fire truck before, this is just completely unnecessary too. There's plenty of room to not block the sidewalk. We see lots of sidewalks without curb cuts at intersections. Another middle finger to anyone with a stroller or wheelchair. We get some groceries and then catch a bus back downtown. We see a road with a bus lane, bike lane, and elevated rail all in one, and we catch our connecting bus back to Miami Beach.
On day 3, we explore around South Beach and come across some of the nicest pedestrian spaces of our trip. First is Lincoln Road, an 8-block long pedestrian mall that was one of the earliest in the US, dating to 1960. There's a high school band from Maryland playing to a pretty big crowd. We also find Espanola Way, built in the 1920s in the style of a Mediterranean village. Strangely, this cozy little street used to allow cars until a few years ago. There's also an eastern portion of the street that's been temporarily pedestrianized by the city, Miami Beach, but which the bigger entity of Miami-Dade County is trying to force back open to cars. We also come across the partly pedestrianized Ocean Drive, which the county has apparently also fought to open back up to cars. This is an interesting dynamic for us because counties in Canada are more of a rural thing. They mostly don't exist in urban areas. And the regional governments that sometimes exist above cities in Canada don't seem to be as powerful as counties in some parts of the US. South Beach in general, and Ocean Drive in particular, is a hotspot for Miami's super popular pastel version of Art Deco. We spend some time at the beach, which is really accessible here. We also like the free outdoor gyms along the beach that actually provide weights. We hop on a bike share to get back to our hotel. On Ocean Drive, we see a practical vehicle well suited to city driving. So far, we've avoided biking because so much of the infrastructure is terrifying. Florida seems to have a thing for putting painted bike lanes or sharrows on literal highways. But Ocean Drive is great, as is the boardwalk, which is so popular that it's often overcrowded. We saw a few other decent bike lanes in Miami Beach, and although we didn't bike around extensively, we definitely got the impression that Miami Beach is better than Miami proper for bike infrastructure. That shows in the bike commuting numbers, which are actually decently high here. 8% of commuters in Miami Beach versus 1% in Miami. We did see this flattened bike route sign, but it's impossible to know who did it. It was probably a cyclist riding dangerously.
Our fourth and final day involves a walk up to North Beach. By now we know how bad the pedestrian experience is on the roads, so we stick to the boardwalk for as long as we can. Once we leave the boardwalk and go into North Beach, we find this truly awful crossing where we wait almost 4 minutes to cross the road. We don't know whether this is malfunctioning or intentional, but it's completely insane. And yes, we and other people pressed the bag button. We posted about it on Twitter and got a few responses from people saying, basically, "So what? Just cross anyway." Maybe that's fine for us, but what about kids, old people? Is this couple supposed to dash across the road with their stroller? We never even got that pedestrian light. We just gave up and crossed in the other direction. What's really strange is that our bad pedestrian experiences aren't even in the suburbs. We didn't accidentally end up on the wrong side of a gated community or something. We've been visiting some of the densest and most lively neighborhoods of the city that get plenty of pedestrian traffic. There are even cyclists and e-scooterers around too. It's just that the roads are not designed for their safety or comfort. On the bright side, the beach is obviously wonderful, and there's a pretty nice park that's really lively. Miami Beach has a free trolley bus that we take back to our hotel.
We only had 4 days in Miami, so we didn't get to explore it as deeply as some other places we visited recently. We were also there for the beach and the weather as much as the city. With that said, we had pretty good coverage for the time we spent, and we got 15 kilometers or 10 miles of walking each day. We're not gonna lie, this is one of the most pedestrian-hostile places we've ever explored on foot. The wide roads, large vehicles, tinted windows, aggressive drivers. Inattentive drivers, lack of crossings, blocked sidewalks, and just the general sense that you don't matter if you're not in a car. It was all a little overwhelming. Thinking how much worse it must be in the suburbs honestly gives us a new perspective on the depths of car dependency in parts of the US.
At the same time, we're happy we visited and we find it hard to write the city off. Getting to experience nice weather, palm trees, and beaches in the middle of winter still made the trip totally worth it. There's more to life than urbanism, or so we've heard. But from an urbanism perspective, there were pedestrian spaces that genuinely impressed us. And depending on where you are, the transit is unique and surprisingly useful. We appreciate cities that have a distinct feel and identity, and Miami definitely fits that bill. This is not a place you confuse for somewhere else. If the pedestrian experience was a low point, the architecture and aesthetic was a high point. Art Deco is super cool, and Miami's pastel take on it even more so. Miami also has the third most skyscrapers of any US city, after New York and Chicago. While some urbanists insist that tall buildings ruin or destroy cities, the reality is that a lot of people like nice skylines and think tall buildings look cool. Okay, we'll admit that Miami's above-ground parking garages are a little goofy, but parking around short buildings doesn't look great either. Miami's tall buildings were fine and sometimes architecturally interesting, and we never got the sense that we should be bothered by them. The number one problem by far was the car-centric street design. And while it's a little baffling that cities have to fight with the county over road improvements, the fact that the fights are happening shows that there's a desire for improvement here. Hopefully it can expand beyond the tourist-heavy areas.
Any suggestion of designing for pedestrians and cyclists in Florida seems to encounter the response of, well, what about the summers? Under the idea that it's not practical to walk or bike in the hot, humid summers, so it's necessary to prioritize cars. This is obviously the reverse of the people in Canada using harsh winters as an argument against active transportation. One big problem with this is that Miami's summer pedestrian and cyclist volumes aren't actually that low. Miami-Dade County has automated counters that do report a dip in the summer, reaching a low in September, but the differences aren't as big as the seasonal variation up north. And part of that summer dip might be fewer tourists visiting when they have summer in their own cities.
We can't deny that summers in Florida are very hot. To be honest, we found the January heat a little overwhelming at times. But many of the problems we identified felt like downright mistreatment or neglect of pedestrians, not serious attempts to design for the heat. Florida gets hot summers, therefore it's acceptable for pedestrians to wait 4 minutes at a light in order to prioritize the movement of people in air-conditioned vehicles? It seems to us that designing for the heat means more shade, fewer dark surfaces like roads and parking lots, and prioritizing, not punishing, the people who are actually experiencing the heat.
While the reflexive dismissal of urbanism based on climate can be frustrating, seriously, people will use any weather as a reason why you can't walk or bike. It is true that urbanism doesn't have to look the same everywhere. We saw as many e-scooters as bikes during our visit, so maybe electric micromobility is just as important as bikes in a place like this, compared to a mild European climate where it is all about the bikes and you don't see as many e-scooters. Maybe public transit, which can be air-conditioned, is particularly important as a driving alternative in hot climates. A few years ago, Miami installed its first air-conditioned bus shelter.
The first enclosed air-conditioned bus shelter in Miami-Dade County was recently unveiled in the city of Hialeah.
We also saw some mist stations on sidewalks.
But we admit that we don't have the same experience with tropical climates that we have with winter climates. So if anyone does live in Florida or another similarly warm and humid climate, let us know in the comments what the biggest challenges are and what you think the way forward is for better cities in climates like this. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.